Good evening. It's 10:30 on New Year's Eve 2020. My name is Toby Mesme and I'm live with you with a MesmePolitics special. First one we've done, but at points, when it's fitting to do so, we will be doing these. So it's a special edition of MesmePolitics. Why are we doing it at this time? Well, we're doing it at this time because the Brexit transition period ends in half an hour. We will formally leave the institutions in whole of the European Union. There'll be a very clear split, a clear break, and we will wake up tomorrow to a Britain fully independent from the European Union. A lot of people are now groaning. Other people are celebrating. It's often been the conventional dichotomy to portray it as the left are sobbing at this, right? And the right are cheering. It's the bigots and the nationalists that were for Brexit, and it's the progressives and the socialists that were for Remain. In my view, this couldn't be more wrong. We're going to delve in over the next half hour to a very in-depth, complex issue, which is my feelings about the European Union, my feelings about the process of Brexit, and my feelings about what the left should do next. Because I thought tonight of all nights would be a good time to put it all out there in one half-hour block, and then not have to keep explaining it again. I'll have said my views, they'll be on record. So, we're going to look at this in three parts. The last part will be, where are we going? What should we be fighting for? The middle will be the left-wing case for Brexit, quite explicitly why the left should have voted to leave the EU and why it should defend our continuation of remaining outside the EU in the future. And the first part, which we'll delve into right now, is why the right have dominated this, what it means, and what's so hideous about it, because there's a lot that's hideous about it. Now, the EU referendum campaign was divisive, it was ugly, it was brutal. The Remain camp was dreadful. It was bankrolled by Goldman Sachs. It was backed up by pretty much the entirety of the British establishment. And it essentially told workers who'd already had most things ripped away from them that they'd lose their jobs if they dared vote leave. Following that, there was an undemocratic People's Vote campaign that sneered at people, that was very much bankrolled by the elite and took advantage of young people's implicit hatred of anti-immigrant sentiment in order to further their establishment goals. There's a lot to unpack. The Remain campaign was dreadful, the People's Vote campaign was even worse. Now, as for the official Leave campaign, so there was the one headed up by Nigel Farage, there was the one headed up by Boris Johnson and Michael Gove. The Nigel Farage's one was particularly insidious, but both of them were horrendous and vile. They came at this from a right-wing perspective. There have always been two traditions of Euroscepticism. There is the right-wing Euroscepticism and the left-wing Euroscepticism. The right-wing Eurosceptics, who drove the referendum, who drove the project, want to basically see whatever minimal workers' protections there are in the EU as tyranny and want to split away from it. It's nationalism, it's British exceptionalism, it's an intrinsic hatred of many European things. They want a low-tax race to the bottom, and for us to become an American proxy, basically, an offshore tax haven off the coast of Dover, of Calais, sorry. That's what they want. As for the left-wing Eurosceptics, they always viewed the EU as militaristic, as damaging, as exploitative, and as thoroughly neoliberal in its economic dogma. An irreformable, dangerous Frankenstein of an organisation that would be the death of all workers' causes. the left are right, though those old Tony Benn and at one point Jeremy Corbyn type arguments were right. They are right. But that does not take away from the fact that in the referendum campaign, the most evil doings were the whipping up of nationalistic, anti-immigrant sentiment that had been carefully cultivated over many years by the right, by Boris Johnson, by Nigel Farage, and outright lies about the NHS, basically saying all these austerity problems are the fault of the EU. And immigrants. The EU makes immigrants come here. Therefore, vote leave, you'll kick out the immigrants, while being factually incorrect. A lot of people went into the polling booth with that in mind. So, because, there was no substantial left-wing campaign to leave, the right owned it. It weaponised people's anger, and it proceeded to direct that anger at immigrants as opposed to at bosses. The EU is a bosses club. The left should have cultivated that anger and directed it against the EU. The right cultivated that anger, cultivated it, weaponised it against migrants and immigrants and refugees and the other and cultural elites and the dog whistle of cultural Marxism, and proceeded to leverage that to their ends, to get people to vote for them, put them in power in the Boris Johnson government, and then enact an economic agenda that is implacably opposed to these people's interests. The Brexit vote, while the 52% are obviously not all voting for these things, a substantial chunk were older, socially conservative voters who were swayed by xenophobic rhetoric, and the driving force, not all, not even an overwhelming majority, but the driving force of that vote, the core, let's say 30% or whatever it was driven by a right-wing nationalistic vote. Okay? In many ways, it was a prejudiced vote. It was a nasty cocktail of toxic political forces, which was whipped up because lots of people were feeling real pain. They were feeling powerless. And it was taken advantage of and directed towards immigrants. That doesn't mean that people who believe things like that can't be saved. They can. Their anger can be directed in different directions, but in this case, it was directed at the people that had nothing to do with the core problems people were recognising. I, in that referendum, would have voted leave, because the EU is horrendous. We'll get onto that in a bit. But that is separate from the nationalism that drove this broader political, the dissension into violence and the very evident peak in mistreatment of immigrants and Europeans in this country. It's not down to the fact we're leaving the EU. It's just the campaigns themselves, not the idea of Brexit, right? It's not leaving a free trading bloc. It's the campaign, the posters of, breaking point and all this bullshit. This was a division in capital. The big banks and most of the corporate establishment were behind Remain because the EU is a bosses club. It operates in their interests. However, some of the entrepreneurial, libertarian side, side of capital wanted to leave. They thought that would help them escape EU tax avoidance initiatives. They thought that would help them start to rip apart whatever modicum of protections and rights the EU allowed. The majority of big money was behind Remain, but you have those predators, corporate, sort of smaller little sharks that of finance capital that wanted to leave. Both sides wanted a race to the bottom. The Remainers want a race to the bottom, foisted on them by Europe. The Leavers wanted a race to the bottom in spite of Europe. The left needed to make the case to leave in that referendum. They need to tap into sentiments of resentment. They need to reach out to young people and make this not about hatred of immigrants. Young people were overwhelmingly for Remain, primarily, not because they believe in the economic status quo, but primarily because they opposed the idea of telling people to go home, of hatred of Europe on a values basis. A Left Leave campaign would have mitigated that. It would have made the case that leaving the EU was not about that. It was not a hatred of Europe. It was a hatred of a neoliberal free trading bloc. It was not about limiting immigration and all these different things. And could have pointed the finger where the real damage was. And of course, much of the problems and the feeling of lack of control in this country did stem from the fact the EU had no democratic legitimacy and imposed things on people that they didn't want. So A, that would have got more young people on side, but B, so we weren't doing this without the consent of young people, which is a bad place to be. But B, it would have dampened and poured water on the flames of xenophobia. That if there was a left case, then once Brexit was voted for, those elements of the alt-right wouldn't have felt quite so emboldened. Following that, the left needed to make the case to implement Lexit, a left-wing Brexit, after the referendum. Instead, many of them were taken in by people's vote. There were huge splits in the Labour base. Lots of young people loved Jeremy Corbyn but wanted to remain. Jeremy Corbyn should have been steadfast, not given an inch of ground to the people's vote. Most of the blame goes to the people's vote for pushing him, but we could have got a softer Brexit or some sort of compromise arrangement that no one would be ideally happy with but would have satisfied all corners of Labour's coalition. The people's vote stopped that, but also Corbyn wavering. Corbyn should have been absolutely steadfast. This was democratic and made the case to those people that so admired him that we just had to do this. Even if you don't like it, we have to do it. I understand why Corbyn campaigned for Remain. Reform is not possible without, the election of a socialist government in Germany, in Spain, in Britain, and all at the same time, and with several terms. It's basically the EU is not a reformable thing. However, he campaigned for that because, his leadership could well have been likely destroyed by the PLP if he'd campaigned for leave, and it may have alienated young people. So, because the left didn't have the structural resources behind them, their message wouldn't have been amplified to the same extent as the right-wing leave message. There were, of course, left-wing leave campaigns, such as the image you see on the screen, Leave, Fight, Transform. Excellent resource, excellent campaign. There were left-wing campaigns for leave, and not just blue Labour, sort of socially conservative ones, genuine progressive campaigns about defending refugees, about taking on Fortress Europe that were for leave. A Tory-driven Brexit will be a race to the bottom, but the EU was never a great defender or a great bulwark against a race to the bottom. Bear that in mind, and also bear in mind that we are still better out than we are in, because now we can vote people out and actually affect our economy. While we're in, whatever we do, there's a neoliberal succubus attached to the underside of our economy. Now, the case for Lexit, left-wing Brexit. I'm going to very succinctly, in the next 10 minutes, try and persuade you why Lexit is what the left should always have been for. And if you're a Remainer or a Remain and Reformer, I have common political cause with you. We're comrades. I have far more in common with you than I do right-wing Eurosceptics. But I want you to try and understand my point of view, because your point of view has been aired plenty, my point of view not so much. And then we either, we have common cause now. We're out the EU, we'll probably be fighting for the exact same things. But let's try and understand the Lexit case, because it's a very comprehensive case. The left-wing case for Brexit is absolutely clear. It's always been clear that socialists... people say, how could a socialist vote to remain? I say, how could a socialist vote to leave? I say, how could a socialist vote to remain? The EU is against basically everything we profess to care about, including immigrants and refugees. The EU has been... The whole project has basically been an imposition of austerity and free market economics on Europe, as well as exploiting the global south. So the EU, and especially the failed euro, has caused harm, great harm, to economies in southern Europe. It's tied their hands. It's enriched German elites at the expense of working people right across Europe, but particularly in the south. See what it did to Greece. You see how the EU have basically imposed austerity measures, or by default basically deposed and imposed governments on other European countries. You see how they leverage things, how they talk very brazenly about democracy not mattering, or holding more referendums after another if people vote against a certain measure. These people have no respect for democracy. It is an unelected class of elite bureaucrats in Europe. It's basically the pooling of the German elites, the French elites, the British elites, all in one big thing. It's a club of the elite, and it is implacably hostile to working people. Simple as that. With these measures in place, and this organisation in place, it takes away many of the things that a socialist wants to change in this country. It remains up as an open question as to whether Jeremy Corbyn's 2017 or 2019 manifestos could credibly have been implemented without a fine from the EU for breaching various terms. People talk about putting up barriers to trade. Since when has the left been for unconditional free trade? Since when have they been for no modicum of protectionism? Since when have they been for basically things Thatcher would have supported? You've got to remember, Thatcher was instrumental in the creation of this thing. And the old school leftists of the time, Tony Benn, were against it. Dennis Skinner campaigned to leave. You can't want to transform our economy to a socialist economy, radical overhaul, and then believe in remaining in the EU and the single market included. The impact of the EU's trade policy on the global south is inherently exploitative, and the problem with that is, well, yes, America does the same thing, Britain does the same thing to an extent. While we're in the EU, we're helping funding that, and even if we elect a government that is against that, which we don't have at the moment, we can't stop it. We're part of it. We're part of Western hegemony. We're part of, exploitation of poorer countries. Fortress Europe would make Priti Patel blush. It is true, because of the government we have, we're essentially going to erect Fortress Britain, which is equally horrendous and needs to be opposed as vociferously. The fact of the matter is, whatever we do in Europe, we can't stop Fortress Europe, which is a massive slaughterhouse around Europe of hideous treatment of refugees and migrants, deploying the same rhetoric that the likes of Nigel Farage deploy here, just on a much larger scale. So instead of, it's one nationalism or another, European supremacy and nationalism or British supremacy and nationalism. So there is not the EU's so tolerant and Brexiteers are so horrendous. No, right-wing Brexiteers are horrendous. The EU's also horrendous. Why would we stay in the thing? We're tied to it forever. And of course the EU has militaristic tendencies, hawkish tendencies, and is wedded to all the things about Western foreign policy that we profess to oppose. So staying in it, it's like wanting to stay in NATO. Why do you want to stay in NATO? Why do you want to stay in the EU? There will be an economic hit from this Brexit, from any Brexit generally, because what we're doing is we're fundamentally altering the structure of our economy. However, a left-wing Brexit would give us the freedom to transform our economy, completely shift the paradigm, and allow us to be kinder to immigrants. It allowed us to be kinder to refugees. It allow us to have more inclusive policy in all those areas. What's happening now is because of a Tory government. It's not because of Brexit in of itself. Okay? The act of leaving the EU isn't causing all this. Right-wing campaigners and a nationalistic project is. I am opposed to the nationalistic project. I'm not opposed to the concept of withdrawal, and I still welcome it, even though these circumstances are immensely far from ideal. We would have, like I say, we have the freedom to do all these wonderful things with our economy. The young would be on board with that. The young oppose Brexit because it goes, as I've said before, it goes against their core values. That's a testament to our generation. We love Europe. We love Europeans. Many of our parents or family are Europeans. We're multicultural. We're diverse. We're progressive. That's our strength. It is a shame that there's never been a high-profile campaign with a high-profile politician for Brexit with those values. Because if so, we could be in a very different political situation right now. We are why we are, because young people implicitly see through the bullshit of Nigel Farage and want to be on the opposite side of whatever Nigel Farage is supporting. I understand that instinct. Before I read up on this, that would have been my default position when I was younger. Of course it would. You see people talking about sending immigrants home, or immigrants leeching off the economy. By the way, European immigrants put more in the economy than they take. You're implacably opposed to that because it's foul, absolutely foul and ungrateful to these people that have given so much to our country. When we lock ourselves out of this thing, right? A left-wing case for Brexit means we would accept all refugees. It means we would be inclusive. We want not just freedom of movement with Europe, we want freedom of movement with the world. These things are political pipe dreams right now. We have a nationalistic right-wing government in power, and the public are opposed to freedom of movement with Europe, pretty much, let alone freedom of movement with anyone else. However, this is I'm making the case that, the left case for Brexit, not about putting up barriers, apart from economically with trade, in order to protect British manufacturing and jobs. There would be no dependence. We don't want to depend overwhelmingly on financial services. We don't want a service economy. We don't want to be depending on capital flying out from Europe, or Europe basically punishing us any moment that we do anything we don't want. We don't want to be chained to transnational capital, which is a thing we're going to have to contend with inside or outside the EU. But inside the EU, it's almost impossible to put up a fight against those forces. Untangling from this thing is going to be much more difficult than joining it. We should never have joined it. Now we're leaving it. It's going to hurt. It's going to sting. Because A, they're going to try and make it as painful as possible, but B, they are going to try and make an example of us. This is what happens when anyone goes against neoliberalism or goes against the establishment. We have to push back against it. We have to fight it. We have to get through this, right? And that gives an example that these forces can be overcome. And then we have to fight, take on, and defeat the right-wing charlatans that have co-opted the concept of Brexit. The EU also exploits immigrants. The single market basically allows companies to leverage by moving from one country to another seamlessly, slashing jobs, slashing rights, whatever the EU charters say, and exploit poorer labour. There's an imbalance, okay? So poorer labour in one part of the European single market can be exploited, brought over here, undercut wages here, vice versa in other ways, and essentially pits one set of workers against another set of workers, which we should always oppose. It exploits poor Europeans from poorer countries by putting them in European countries that are richer. It turns workers in one country against workers in another. It's an erosion of solidarity. It is a boss's game, and because of the flimsiness of the freedom of movement system, people are they're forced to cooperate with this, right? Because people are told, right, you'll be deported if you say you're being exploited. We need comprehensive, full comprehensive freedom of movement with transparency, and freedom of movement of people is good. Freedom of movement of capital and sort of a labour force in that sense is the wet dream of financial capital, because it allows them to undercut wages everywhere and exploit everyone. That has to be fought back. That's not about stopping immigration. There's no problem with immigration coming in. There is no such thing as too much immigration. But we're talking about the way labour forces work, the way it works to undercut wages when you have imbalances in the wealth of different economies. People like Nigel Farage turn that into bigotry. I'm making it pure economic fact that the single market allows workers from poorer countries to come to richer countries and undercut wages from richer countries. It just is how it is. That's something we have to fight. We can only fight that while outside the EU. And that's not about ending freedom of movement. Obviously that's happening, but it's not about that. It is about making a new system that prevents the free movement of capital and businesses in this exploitative single market that has co-opted the principle of single movement into something nasty when it should be something about living, laughing, loving abroad. Because I reiterate, Europe is marvellous. It's a marvellous place. Now, these are all things the left gets very uncomfortable talking about, because it often sounds like you're heading into the scapegoating of immigrants or immigrant labour. I reiterate, immigrants put more into the economy than they take out. They're a net benefit. Immigrants coming to work here is not what's undercutting wages. It's this very specific way it's done by these companies. It's not just the fact someone came from Eastern Europe to work here. It's the way they've been brought in by a company in a very specific way to exploit weaknesses in rules and deregulate the labour market in Britain, which hurts everyone. Now, where are we now? Where do we go from here? This deal ties us into some shackles, particularly on state aid-related provisions, meaning that some things we would want to do outside the EU, we actually can't do. These things can be renegotiated, they can be tweaked by any future government, and it puts us in a much better position than we would be otherwise. A closer relationship, for better or worse, is likely with Europe in the future. In some ways, that's good. We do want a closer relationship in various areas. In other areas, I almost want a more distant relationship. It's really tricky. I don't want anything to do with the single market. I don't want to be tied into these sort of neoliberal shackles. But there are, we could do some sort of reciprocal arrangement on freedom of movement in the future. We could look at cooperation on things like tax avoidance, etc., etc., and maybe even some provisions to ensure neither of us engage in a race to the bottom, but nothing that restricts our ability to transform our economy. No privatisation initiatives, which is what the EU pushes. Fortress Britain is something to oppose and fight. It's against our values, and it is dreadful, and it is nationalistic, but the EU is no bulwark against any of these evils, and is partly to blame for much of the resentment of European immigrants, because the way it's taken power from people has allowed European immigrants to be scapegoated when they've done nothing wrong. A left project in Britain should focus on making a Lexit vision possible, winning power and creating a progressive future outside the EU. Progressive in such a way that young people are happy with it, don't feel like we've betrayed our values, and see that we're thriving in a progressive, open sense outside the EU. As opposed to what we're about to get, and as opposed to rejoining. Rejoining is a headache of a proposition, but it's highly plausible. In the future, it's wholly likely it could happen. It might not, but it's likely. It's also likely we may get some sort of Norway-style agreement, which is too close for my comfort, but again, could happen. Would be much better than being in the EU. Maybe it won't happen. Maybe I'm being pessimistic. But if young people remain implacably opposed to Brexit and nothing changes in that sense, and the left don't find power, we could see a majority for rejoin. The left must fight that and convince progressive people in Britain that that is not the way to get what we all want. We all want the same thing. We all want closeness with Europe. We all want to feel like Europeans. We all want, I'm a European. We all want to have all those things that people feel like the nationalistic elements of Brexit took from them. My argument is that rejoining a neoliberal free trading bloc isn't how to do that. The way to do that is to kick the Nigel Farages and the Boris Johnsons from power. Rejoin, as I say, it's a headache. We've got to fight it. I will not compromise my principles on this matter. I don't care how unpopular it is in the future. I will campaign against rejoining the EU. I will campaign to stay in the EU, and I will also campaign against the bastards that are running the government, the bastards that demonise, exploit and bully Europeans. And all immigrants of all cultures, all faiths, all backgrounds. This Brexit will be driven by charlatans and bastards. It will not deliver much of what we'd want from Lexit, and it is a woeful deal, and it will be harmful. And it will initiate a race to the bottom. But this is also a good move in the sense that it gives us much more freedom in the future, and it is, however you look at it, a hit to neoliberalism. It's a hit to finance capital, and it is a hit to the establishment. We now have to fight the people who want to turn Britain into a low-tax, low-wage, deregulated economy. We have to boot them from office, and we have to fight it. And now, in 10 seconds, we leave the institutions of the European Union. For better or for worse, this is it. We've left. That's it. It's over. The fight's over. The battles are won. And now we move on to fighting for that vision of a Britain we can all believe in.